The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the worn wooden floors of Rivera's community boxing gym when Marcus Thunder Thompson pushed through the heavy doors like he owned the place. His gold chain caught the light as he strutted past rows of punching bags, each step echoing his arrogance through the humid air that smelled of sweat and determination. 3 state championship belts had made Marcus believe he was untouchable, and today he planned to prove it once again. The other young boxers immediately stopped their training to watch him, some with admiration, others with barely hidden fear. Marcus loved this attention, feeding off it like fuel for his oversized ego. He flexed his muscles deliberately, throwing practice punches that cut through the air with sharp whistling sounds, making sure everyone could see the power behind each movement. Near the registration desk, a slender 16-year-old girl named Zara Williams quietly filled out paperwork, her hand trembling slightly as she wrote her name on the boxing program application. She had been gathering courage for months to walk through those doors, hoping that learning to fight might help her stand up to the bullies at school who made her life miserable every single day. Her worn sneakers and secondhand workout clothes marked her as different from the other kids. But what really set her apart was the quiet intensity in her dark eyes that suggested hidden depths beneath her shy exterior. Marcus noticed her immediately, and his predatory smile spread across his face like a shark sensing blood in the water. Well, he announced loudly, making sure his voice carried across the entire gym so everyone would stop and listen. Looks like we got ourselves a new little princess who wants to play boxer. The other teenagers began to gather around, some laughing nervously while others looked uncomfortable but afraid to speak up against Marcus. Zara kept her head down, focusing on wrapping her hands with the cheap cloth strips she had bought at a discount store, but her jaw tightened with each cruel word. Marcus stepped closer, towering over her with his 6-foot frame, his shadow falling across her small workspace like a dark cloud. I bet this little girl couldn't hurt a fly even if her life depended on it, he continued, his voice getting nastier with each syllable. The gym fell silent, except for the rhythmic sound of someone hitting a speed bag in the corner, creating an odd musical backdrop to the brewing confrontation. Coach Rivera, a weathered man in his 50s, who had seen too many bullies come and go, started walking over from across the gym. But Marcus was already building momentum like a freight train that couldn't be stopped. "Hey coach," Marcus called out with fake sweetness that fooled nobody. "How about we give our new friend here a proper welcome to the sport? Just one friendly round to show her what real boxing looks like." The suggestion hung in the air, like smoke, and suddenly every eye in the gym was focused on the unlikely pair. Some kids started chanting "fight, fight, fight" under their breaths, caught up in the excitement without thinking about the cruelty behind it. Zara finally looked up from her hand wraps, and for the first time, Marcus saw something in her eyes that made him pause for just a moment. Not fear, not submission, but a calm determination that seemed completely out of place in someone so young and small. "One round," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying clearly through the now silent gym. Marcus laughed, a harsh sound that bounced off the concrete walls, thinking he had just won the easiest victory of his life. "But we do this right," Zara continued, standing up slowly and meeting his gaze with surprising steadiness. "Proper rules, proper respect, proper technique." Something in her tone made a few of the watching teenagers shift uncomfortably, as if they suddenly realized they might be witnessing something more serious than they had bargained for. Marcus was already imagining how he would toy with her, maybe let her throw a few pathetic punches before ending it with a light tap that would send her running home in tears, cementing his reputation as the undisputed king of the gym. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that hidden in Zara's quiet exterior lay a secret that would soon turn his world completely upside down. Every morning for the past 2 years, she had been running 5 miles through the city streets before dawn, her breath creating small clouds in the cold air as her feet found their rhythm on cracked sidewalks. Every evening, she had spent hours in her grandfather's converted garage, learning combinations and footwork from a man who had once been known as Iron Sam Williams, a Golden Gloves champion who had given up his boxing career to serve his country in Vietnam. Her grandfather had taught her that real strength doesn't come from hurting others, but from the discipline to control yourself even when others try to break you down. As Marcus continued to showboat for his audience, flexing and throwing wild punches at imaginary opponents, Zara closed her eyes for a brief moment and heard her grandfather's voice echoing in her memory. Boxing isn't about being the toughest person in the room, sweetheart. It's about having the courage to face whatever comes at you with dignity and skill. The bell that would start their match hadn't even rung yet, but everyone in that gym could feel that something extraordinary was about to happen. Something that would change not just Marcus and Zara, but every person who witnessed it. The boxing ring suddenly felt smaller as Marcus climbed through the ropes, his gold chain bouncing with each exaggerated movement while he raised his arms to acknowledge the cheers from his followers, who had gathered around the elevated platform. He threw a series of flashy combinations into the empty air, his gloves whistling as they cut through space in perfect rhythm, each punch designed more for show than actual fighting technique. The crowd of teenagers pressed closer to the ring, their phones already recording what they expected to be Marcus's easiest victory yet. Zara stepped through the ropes on the opposite side with quiet grace, moving like someone who belonged in this space, even though most people saw only a shy girl who looked completely out of place among the leather and sweat of a serious boxing gym. While Marcus continued his theatrical warm-up routine, throwing uppercuts and hooks that sparkled under the fluorescent lights, Zara stood motionless in her corner with her eyes closed, her breathing slow and controlled as she centered herself for what was about to come. The watching crowd couldn't see the memories flooding through her mind at that moment, memories of countless mornings when she had slipped out of her apartment before sunrise, her mother still asleep after working a double shift at the hospital, and made her way through empty streets to her grandfather's garage where the real training happened. Samuel Iron Sam Williams had been waiting for her every single morning for 2 years, his weathered hands still quick enough to hold focus mitts, while his granddaughter learned the sweet science of boxing from someone who had once been considered unstoppable in his weight class. The garage smelled of motor oil and old leather, filled with equipment that Sam had collected over decades of training fighters, and it was there that Zara had transformed from a frightened girl into something much more dangerous. A disciplined athlete with lightning-fast reflexes and the kind of mental toughness that only comes from facing your fears every single day. Sam had taught her that boxing was like chess played at the speed of light, where every movement had meaning and every second of hesitation could mean defeat. He had shown her how to read an opponent's body language, how to spot the tiny tells that revealed which punch was coming next, and most importantly, how to stay calm when everyone around you was losing their minds. While Marcus shadowboxed for his audience, Zara remembered her grandfather's voice from just that morning. Today might be the day, little warrior. Today you might have to show the world what you're really made of. The old man had seen something in his granddaughter that even she didn't fully understand yet, a natural talent that combined with relentless training could produce something truly special. Every morning for 24 months, Zara had run 5 miles through the city before school, her feet finding their rhythm on cracked sidewalks while most teenagers were still dreaming in their beds. Every evening, she had spent 3 hours in that garage, hitting the heavy bag until her knuckles were raw, working the speed bag until her hands moved faster than her eyes could follow, and sparring with imaginary opponents while Sam called out combinations and corrections. Her school backpack was always heavy with textbooks, but it was also weighted down with hand wraps, mouth guards, and the kind of determination that comes from having something to prove to yourself rather than to others. The other kids at school saw only what they expected to see, a quiet girl who kept to herself, who never caused trouble, who seemed to disappear into the background of every classroom and hallway. They had no idea that beneath her oversized hoodies and worn jeans was the lean muscle of a trained fighter, or that behind her downcast eyes was the tactical mind of someone who had studied boxing the way other kids studied video games. Coach Rivera rang the bell to start the first round, and immediately Marcus charged forward like a bull, throwing wild haymaker punches that were meant to end the fight in spectacular fashion within the first few seconds. His right hand swept through the air where Zara's head had been just a moment before, but she had already moved, slipping the punch with fluid movement that made it look like she had simply melted away from danger. Marcus threw a left hook that should have caught her moving to the right, but Zara had anticipated this follow-up and was already ducking under his arm, staying close enough to feel the wind from his glove, but far enough away to remain completely safe. The crowd began to murmur with surprise as Marcus's third and fourth punches found nothing but empty air, his face growing red with frustration and exertion, while Zara continued to move around him like smoke, never in the same place twice, always one step ahead of his increasingly desperate attacks. She hadn't thrown a single punch in return, choosing instead to study him like a scientist, examining a specimen under a microscope, cataloging his patterns, timing his combinations, noting how he dropped his left hand after throwing his right cross and how he telegraphed his hooks by shifting his weight too early. This was exactly what her grandfather had taught her, that the first round of any fight belonged to the person who could learn the most about their opponent while revealing the least about themselves. Marcus grew more frustrated with each missed punch, his perfect hair beginning to stick to his forehead with sweat, his breathing becoming labored from throwing power shots that connected with nothing but air. "What's wrong with you?" he taunted between heavy breaths, trying to hide his growing panic behind aggression, too scared to fight back like a real boxer. But Zara's expression remained calm, almost meditative, as she continued to make him miss by inches that might as well have been miles. The watching crowd had gone from cheering to complete silence. Realizing they were witnessing something they had never seen before, Marcus Thunder Thompson, the three-time state champion, being made to look clumsy and predictable by a girl who hadn't even tried to hurt him yet. In the final 30 seconds of the round, when Marcus had exhausted himself throwing punches at a ghost, Zara finally decided it was time to announce her presence. She waited for him to throw his signature combination, right cross, left hook, right uppercut, and as his final punch sailed harmlessly past her ear, she stepped in and threw a perfect counter right hand that caught him flush on the jaw, snapping his head back and sending a shockwave of disbelief through every person watching the fight. The sound of Zara's glove connecting with Marcus's jaw echoed through the gym like a gunshot, followed by absolute silence that felt heavier than the humid air itself, as if everyone present had forgotten how to breathe at the exact same moment. Marcus staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief, one hand instinctively rising to touch the spot where her punch had landed with surgical precision. His mind struggling to process what had just happened to his perfect record, an untouchable reputation. Between rounds, he sat heavily on the small stool in his corner, staring across the ring at Zara, who remained standing calmly, her breathing still controlled, and even while his own chest heaved with exhaustion and something that felt dangerously close to panic. His cornermen frantically tried to motivate him with urgent whispers about maintaining his dominance and showing everyone who was boss. But their words sounded hollow and distant, because Marcus could no longer ignore the growing realization that he had walked into something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The crowd around the ring had shifted from excited spectators to stunned witnesses, their phones still recording, but their expressions showing confusion and amazement as they tried to understand how their invincible champion had been made to look ordinary by someone they had dismissed as helpless just minutes earlier. Zara stood in her corner like a statue of quiet confidence, remembering her grandfather's teachings about the mental side of fighting, how the strongest opponent wasn't necessarily the one with the biggest muscles or the loudest mouth, but the one who could think clearly when everyone else was losing their minds. She had learned that boxing was 90% mental warfare, where winning happened in the space between your ears, long before your fists decided the outcome, and she could see in Marcus's eyes that he was already fighting a battle against his own doubt and fear. The bell rang for the second round, and Marcus came out more carefully this time, trying to use his height and reach advantage, instead of charging forward like an angry bull. But Zara had spent countless hours with her grandfather studying video footage of professional fighters, learning to read body language and predict attacks before they happened. Every slight shift in Marcus's weight told her which direction he was planning to move. Every tiny change in his guard revealed which punch he was setting up, and every frustrated expression on his face showed her exactly how much his confidence was crumbling with each passing second. She began to counterpunch with the precision of a surgeon, landing clean shots to his body and head while slipping away from his increasingly desperate responses, making him miss by just enough distance to look foolish without being so obvious that it appeared like she was showing off. The watching teenagers pressed closer to the ring ropes. Their earlier excitement transformed into something deeper and more meaningful as they witnessed not just a physical contest, but a demonstration of how preparation and discipline could overcome size and reputation. Tanya Rodriguez, a 15-year-old girl who had been mercilessly teased about her weight for years, found herself standing straighter for the first time in months, her heart pounding with excitement, as she watched someone prove that being underestimated could become your greatest weapon. Miguel Santos, barely 14, and convinced that his small size doomed him to a lifetime of being pushed around by bigger kids, clenched his fists and felt something awakening inside his chest that he had never experienced before. The belief that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to accept being a victim. Even some of Marcus's former followers began to look uncomfortable as they watched their hero struggling against someone they had expected him to dominate, forcing them to question why they had been so eager to see another person get humiliated for their entertainment. The fight was becoming something bigger than just two people throwing punches at each other. It was turning into a moment of truth that would change how everyone in that gym thought about strength, courage, and what it really meant to be powerful. Zara moved around the ring like water flowing around rocks, her footwork so smooth that she seemed to glide rather than step, always in perfect position to counter Marcus's attacks while staying just out of range of his desperate attempts to land something, anything, that might restore his fading dominance. Each perfectly timed combination she threw was a lesson in technique over brute force, a demonstration that real skill came from countless hours of practice rather than natural talent alone, and every clean shot that found its mark was proof that the quiet kids, the overlooked ones, the students who sat in the back of the classroom and never caused trouble, might be hiding depths that nobody suspected. Marcus's breathing grew more labored with each exchange, not just from physical exhaustion but from the crushing weight of realizing that everything he thought he knew about himself was crumbling like sand between his fingers, and for the first time in his life he was experiencing what it felt like to be completely outclassed by someone who had never boasted, never threatened, never tried to make him feel small. The crowd watched in mesmerized silence as Zara continued her methodical dismantling of everything Marcus represented, not with cruelty or revenge, but with the kind of calm competence that made her opponent's flaws seem obvious in comparison. And suddenly every person in that gym understood they were witnessing something that would stay with them forever. The moment when an underdog became a hero simply by refusing to accept the limitations that others had placed on her. The third round bell rang like a funeral toll through the silent gym, and Marcus stumbled to his feet with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for anything that might save him from going under completely. His perfect hair was now soaked with sweat and plastered against his forehead. His gold chain had somehow gotten tangled during the previous round, and his breathing came in short gasps that made him sound more like a scared child than a 3-time state champion. The crowd around the ring had grown larger as word spread through the community center that something incredible was happening in the boxing gym, and now even adults were pressing against the ropes to witness what everyone was calling the impossible upset of the century. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, judging him, measuring him against the reputation he had built so carefully over years of easy victories. And for the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to be the underdog, to be the one everyone expected to fail. His cornermen had run out of advice between rounds, reduced to desperately slapping his shoulders and shouting generic encouragement that fooled nobody, especially not Marcus himself, who could see the doubt creeping into their eyes as they realized their champion was being systematically destroyed by someone they had never even heard of until today. Zara moved toward the center of the ring with the same calm confidence she had shown from the beginning. But now there was something different in her posture, a subtle shift that suggested she was ready to end this demonstration and move on to more important things. Marcus threw a wild overhand right that telegraphed itself so obviously that even the youngest kids in the crowd could see it coming from across the gym, putting every ounce of his remaining strength and desperation behind the punch because he knew this might be his last chance to salvage something from this nightmare. The punch whistled through empty air as Zara stepped aside with minimal effort, leaving Marcus completely off balance and vulnerable, spinning halfway around from the momentum of his own missed attack, like a dancer who had forgotten the choreography. In that moment of perfect opportunity, with Marcus defenseless and stumbling, Zara could have ended everything with a devastating counterpunch that would have sent him crashing to the canvas in front of everyone who had ever looked up to him or feared him. The entire crowd held its breath, phones recording, waiting for the knockout blow that would complete Marcus's total humiliation and cement Zara's place in gym legend forever. But instead of throwing the finishing punch, Zara stepped backward and shook her head slowly, her expression showing not triumph or cruelty, but something that looked almost like sadness for what Marcus had become. "This isn't what boxing is supposed to be about," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the silent gym so that every person present could hear the disappointment and wisdom in her words. The simple statement hit Marcus harder than any punch could have, cutting through all his defenses and striking directly at the core of who he had allowed himself to become over the years of easy victories and cheap applause. He stopped moving completely, his gloves dropping to his sides as he stared at this girl who had just shown him more mercy than he had ever shown anyone else. And suddenly, he could see himself through her eyes, not as a champion or a hero, but as a scared young man who had used his fists to hide from his own insecurities and fears. The realization crashed over him like a wave, washing away years of false pride and revealing the empty space underneath where his real character should have been. And for the first time since he was a small child, Marcus felt tears beginning to build behind his eyes. The crowd sensed the shift in the atmosphere. The way the air in the gym had changed from electric anticipation to something deeper and more meaningful, as if they were witnessing not just the end of a fight, but the beginning of something entirely different. Marcus pulled off his gloves with shaking hands and let them fall to the canvas with soft thuds that seemed to echo through the suddenly sacred space of the boxing ring. And then he walked slowly to the center, where Zara waited with infinite patience, like a teacher who had been expecting this moment all along. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking with emotion that he had spent years learning to suppress. The words coming out broken and raw, but more honest than anything he had said in longer than he could remember. "You didn't deserve any of this treatment, any of the things I said, or the way I tried to make you look small in front of everyone." Tears were flowing freely down his face now, cutting tracks through the sweat and washing away the mask he had worn for so long that he had almost forgotten there was a real person underneath it. "You're a better fighter than I'll ever be," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word of truth he spoke. "And you're a better person than I've been to anyone in years." The handshake that followed wasn't the quick, dismissive gesture that usually ended amateur boxing matches, but a moment of genuine human connection that seemed to last forever, while the watching crowd stood in complete silence, understanding that they were witnessing something that would change them all. Zara's grip was firm, but gentle, her eyes showing forgiveness and understanding that Marcus knew he didn't deserve but desperately needed. And in that moment he felt something shift inside his chest, like a door opening after being locked for years. Coach Rivera stepped through the ropes, with tears in his own weathered eyes, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at the two young fighters who had just taught everyone present a lesson that no textbook could ever contain. "This," he announced, to the stunned crowd, raising both their hands together in a gesture of shared victory. "This is what real champions look like." 6 months after that life-changing afternoon in Rivera's boxing gym, the morning sun streamed through the windows to illuminate a scene that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had witnessed Marcus's humiliation and Zara's triumph on that fateful day. The same gym that had once echoed with cruel laughter and the sound of Marcus bullying smaller kids, now buzzed with purposeful energy as dozens of young people from across the city gathered for what had become known as the Champions Program, an anti-bullying initiative that combined boxing training with character development in ways that were transforming lives throughout the community. Zara stood in the center of the main floor, no longer the quiet, scared girl who had once filled out registration papers with trembling hands, but a confident young woman whose presence commanded respect without demanding it, teaching a group of middle school students the same footwork patterns her grandfather had drilled into her during those early morning sessions in his converted garage. Her voice carried clearly across the gym as she explained that real strength came not from hurting others, but from the discipline to control yourself even when every instinct screamed for revenge, and the kids listened with the kind of attention that teachers dream about, but rarely see, in traditional classrooms. Marcus worked alongside her as both training partner and co-instructor, his transformation even more dramatic than Zara's, because he had fallen from such great heights before finding his way back to something resembling decency and honor. The gold chain was gone, replaced by a simple pendant that had belonged to his father, and the arrogant swagger had been replaced by genuine humility that made him more approachable to the younger kids who had once feared him. Together, they had created something beautiful from the ashes of that brutal afternoon when everything had changed, turning their story into a foundation for helping others discover that their greatest battles were often fought against their own worst impulses rather than against external enemies. The program had grown far beyond what anyone expected when Coach Rivera first suggested they share their experience with other young people who struggled with similar issues of identity, self-worth, and the temptation to use violence as a solution. Two complicated problems. Students came from schools across 3 different districts, drawn by word-of-mouth stories about the place where former enemies had become best friends, and where learning to fight had somehow taught people how to avoid fighting altogether. Tanya Rodriguez, the girl who had once been tormented about her weight, now served as a peer counselor for other students facing body image issues, her confidence radiating outward like sunlight as she helped newcomers understand that their worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions or society's narrow definitions of beauty. Miguel Santos had grown 3 inches and gained 20 pounds of muscle, but more importantly, he had discovered a voice that could speak up for others who couldn't defend themselves, becoming the kind of person who stepped between bullies and their victims instead of looking the other way, like most people did when confronted with cruelty. Even former members of Marcus's old crew had joined the program, drawn by curiosity about their leader's transformation and staying because they discovered something they hadn't expected to find, a sense of purpose that came from building others up instead of tearing them down for entertainment. The boxing training itself had become almost secondary to the deeper work of character development, though everyone who participated learned proper technique, conditioning, and the mental discipline that came with serious athletic training. What made the program unique was how it combined physical skills with emotional intelligence. teaching participants to recognize the warning signs of their own anger, fear, and insecurity before those feelings could manifest in destructive behavior toward others or themselves. Zara often told new students about her grandfather's philosophy, explaining how Samuel Iron Sam Williams had taught her that the strongest people were those who could remain calm in chaos, who could show mercy when they had the power to cause harm, and who understood that true victory came from helping others discover their own strength rather than proving your superiority over them. The walls of the gym were now covered with photographs and testimonials from program graduates who had gone on to become leaders in their schools and communities. Young people who credited their time in the Champions program with changing not just how they handled conflict, but how they thought about their responsibilities to others. Marcus kept a special photo in his gym bag, not of any trophy or championship belt, but of the moment he and Zara shook hands in the ring after their fight, both of them crying, both of them changed forever by what they had discovered about themselves and each other. He would look at that photo whenever he felt tempted to slip back into old patterns of thinking, using it as a reminder of how much better life could be when you chose connection over competition, understanding over judgment, and growth over the cheap satisfaction of making others feel small. The program's success had attracted attention from educators, community leaders, and even sports psychologists who came to study how two teenagers had managed to create something that traditional anti-bullying programs had struggled to achieve for decades. But Marcus and Zara always insisted that their approach wasn't revolutionary or complicated. It was simply based on the understanding that most people who hurt others are themselves hurting, and that healing could happen when someone cared enough to see past the surface behavior to the pain underneath. Years later, when journalists asked Zara about the fight that had made her famous in their community, she would smile with the kind of peace that comes from knowing you've found your true purpose in life, and say, "The best part wasn't proving I could fight back against someone who wanted to hurt me. The best part was discovering that helping someone else become their better self was more satisfying than any victory I could win for myself alone."